Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video which is going to be all about making this year's pumpkin project. And if you have no idea what that is, then you probably haven't been following me for very long. But basically every year I make a Halloween inspired costume that I can photograph in a local pumpkin patch. I've been doing this for a good long while now, and it's pretty much always my favorite project that I make that year. I love taking inspiration from autumnal colors and making something inspired by the beautiful environment that project is ultimately photographed in. Last year I took inspiration from the 1890s, and this year I took some inspiration from the 1500s. I was very inspired by the garments from this book, as well as a fabric that I had in my stash that was a bright orange silk suiting. And like a lot of fabrics that I buy, this one wasn't really an appropriate weight for a dress. However, I thought it would work perfectly for one of these ridiculous Renaissance menswear inspired ensembles. And once I began thinking about pairing that fabric with this idea, I started realizing that the pained poofy pants that were in a lot of these paintings sort of resembled pumpkins. I mean, if you squint and pretend that they're orange. And of course, after I realized that, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. I had to make ridiculous Renaissance pumpkin pants a reality. So I make those in this video, and I also make a doublet or bodice to go with it, and a chemise to wear underneath it. And over on Patreon, I'll be making a hat to pair with it as well. And all of that comes together to create this ridiculous, and in my opinion, wonderful Renaissance ensemble that looks perfect in a pumpkin patch. And now for the video that shows most of the process of putting it all together. So this fabric has really ugly beads on it. I bought it because I love the color. It's a silk suiting, and it looked like a weight that would be perfect for some sort of medieval costume. I also really liked the embroidery on it and how it's the same color as the silk, but it has shinier threads. However, in person, the beads are just really ugly. I want to pair this with black, so I don't like the color of them to begin with. And they're also sort of large for how far apart they're spaced, and they're also spaced sort of randomly, and they're not shiny. They're just dull wooden beads. So I really didn't like how they looked. I thought they took away from the fabric as opposed to adding to it. And because I wanted to cut this fabric into strips, and I also wanted to press those strips, I knew they would get in the way of that process. So I've just decided to remove them, which is very, very tedious. This is how many I ended up removing it from about 3 yards of fabric, and I have 5 yards of material left. It took me 2 hours to do this, so it's pretty freaking tedious. But I did manage to get that done and get my strips cut out. I also went ahead and cut out the lining for the pants, and I got all of the beads removed from these too. After I finished removing the beads from a little less than 2 yards of fabric, I did cut it into 2-inch wide strips, and this morning I got all of those strips sewn together, and I'm in the process of ironing the edges inward, and they're going to be pressed inward to the center point so they touch. So the strips are then 1 inch wide with neatly finished edges that will be top stitched to piping and neatly covered with twill tape lining. I've also cut out the bodice pieces from the orange, so now I have to go through and remove all the beads from these. There's also going to be some sort of yoke detail made out of velvet, and then there's going to be black lace on this, but I'm not going to move forward with that until I finished the base for the bodice, which I've also cut out of canvas over here. Well, actually I haven't cut it out of canvas. I did transfer the outline onto canvas, and I just measured the seam allowance distance away from each edge because I don't want this material to extend into edges. It is a relatively thick canvas, and it's going to be boned, and it's actually going to be quilted to another layer of slightly lighter canvas, so it's really structurally solid, and I just don't need that extra rigidity and that extra bulk in the seam allowance. So here you can see I've done that for this piece as well. So the next step for these is going to be marking the boning channel placement. I'm running a little bit low on the 1/4 inch plastic boning that I usually use, so I think I'm going to use something called Wriggling. I believe that's what it's called. I'll put the name of it on screen. And I don't have a lot of experience with this, but you can sew through it. It is plastic, so it does add some structural element to the material, and hopefully this can help reinforce large parts of this. Now, something I'm not sure I mentioned in that pile of orange strips that I just showed you is that I did some math for this yesterday prior to getting started. I figured out how many strips there are going to be on each pant leg, how wide those strips will be, and also how long those strips have to be. So each strip is going to be 50% longer than the length of the lining it's covering. So for example, this is 5 inches wide, but the strip that covers it is going to be 7.5 inches. I had to go ahead and repeat that math for the upper portion of each panel as well. So this one measures 8 inches, which means the strip covering it will be 12 inches. This one's 9 inches, which means the strip will be 13.5 inches, and so on and so forth. And there are 19 strips per a leg, and since each of those strips is at least 20 inches long generally, that means I needed like 25 yards of material just to create the paint portion on these pants, or thereabouts. I definitely rounded up because I'm going to be using the same technique on the sleeves, which I haven't drafted yet, so it's more convenient for me to end up with extra than not enough. But either way, it's a whole lot of pained strips or 1 inch wide strips I need to create these pants. And each of those strips is going to have piping on either edge, which means I have 60 yards or so of piping to create. So using a whole bunch of velvet scraps I had, I tried to cut pieces that were approximately on the bias. And then this morning I got them seamed together. I have not measured these. I have no idea how long it is, but hopefully it will be enough to give me a good start. And these strips are just 1.5 inches. So once they're folded over the piping cord will take up about a 1/2 inch. And then the lip of the piping will be a 1/2 inch, which is good since it'll be sewn on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm probably going to end up having to make more of that. I just want to be conservative because I think I'm going to use velvet for another part of this project and I don't have a ton of it left. I definitely have enough of it left. Like I'll be able to make it work, but I didn't want to cut far more than I needed. So if I have to make more piping, I will. But in realizing that I needed 60 yards of piping, I realized I didn't have enough piping cord. So I've actually managed to order what I need on Amazon and it should be here today, which is great. Instead of making some of the piping with what I have, I'm just going to wait for my replacement to arrive. So then the piping will all be the same width and match on every element of the project. So that's why today I'm just doing the prep work for those strips and pressing the edges inward. And it's also why I've gotten started on the bodice. So yeah, this is where I am right now. I'm going to mark the boning placement on this, I think, and then just carry on with pressing my orange strips since that's going to take a while and try and get that all ready to be piped later today. Minnie didn't bark once in that 8-minute long clip I was filming. I think she's trying to make up for peeing in her cave twice yesterday, despite me taking her out almost every hour. I'm not saying that this is why Posey's my favorite, but it's not why she's my favorite. I just relate to Posey and her desire to constantly be sleeping and or eating. Did I completely make this boning pattern up because I don't know what I'm doing? Perhaps. I always get questions about how I figure out boning placement, and the answer is I have no idea, I guess. So I've got a lot of boning at the front where my bust and my stomach is, and then I have a little bit of boning at the sides where the eyelids will be, and also because I don't want the garment to droop there. And then I have a lot at the back because the back is sort of what causes the garment to sit properly on your shoulders, and it's also really prone to having ripples. So those big blocks that you see mapped out are where boning is going to be. I'm not bringing it all the way to the top because that's where your shoulders and your neck sort of slopes inward, and the boning can keep away from the body if you bring it all the way up that high. And the same can be said for the front too. I don't want it to sort of be gaping away from the top of my chest. I'd rather stop underneath it. So that is the logic there. I'm going to be using the Rigoline that I don't have much experience with for the vast majority of this, and then the smaller boning channels are either going to be metal or plastic or a combination of the two. I do want the corners of the neckline to be nice and sharp though, so I'm bringing the boning up a little bit higher right there and there at the corners, and then everything here is going to be lower down. So that is the current situation, and now I guess I have a whole bunch of plastic boning to sew on, and hopefully it is relatively easy to sew on, and my thread doesn't frequently break, making me increasingly more frustrated because I do have plans to sew quite a bit of this boning on. So this looks absolutely horrible, but I've gone ahead and sewn in all the plastic boning that you can stitch through, and then for the places where I needed smaller, more durable bones, I just sewed twill tape boning channels. So everything is done, and I used a whole bunch of different bobbin thread colors on this. Now the next step is going to be laying another layer of canvas over top of this and just quilting them together sort of with rows of stitching that are about 1 inch apart to reinforce portions like at the shoulder a little bit further. And after that is done, I can cut around all of the lines and get this sewn into the outer layer of the fabric. All right, there were some annoying delays, but finally my piping cord came. It's actually nylon cotton unglazed theater cord, and I will link where I purchased this from down below. So I already had my velvet strips cut out. I did measure them this morning, and I only had approximately 40 yards cut out, so I did cut an extra 10 yards of strips, and I don't think that's going to be enough, but hopefully that is a decent start. And then I just wrapped those strips over top of the cord and sewed relatively close to the cord by machine using a relatively long stitch length, and it's black thread on black material, so it's probably going to be difficult to see. But there is the piping on this side, and then there's the 1/2 inch lip on this side. So I made 50 yards of that, and then I sewed it onto either side of a piece of 1 inch wide twill tape. So I want the fabric portion of my paned panels to be 1 inch wide with the piping on either side. So instead of sewing those onto the strips and hoping that the seam allowance will be even, and then hand stitching something to the back to hide the raw edges from the piping, I've instead just stitched the piping onto either side of twill tape. So then from the front, it looks like this. You've got both raw edges exposed. You've got the piping evenly spaced 1 inch apart. And then in the center of that, I'm going to put the strips that I've already cut out and turned the edges inward. It's a link where I got the twill tape from down below. And these are my strips. So I have many of these, and I think I filmed cutting these out. They were each 2 inches wide, and then I was tasked with folding the edges inward and pressing them so the strips were all 1 inch wide. So now I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to put my orange fabric strips in between the two pieces of piping and then stitch really close to either edge of the orange using using matching thread. There will be visible stitching, which isn't my favorite on historical projects, but I don't think it'll be too noticeable given the weave and how good the color matches. So I'm not saying that I'm getting started really late today at about noon because I spent the entire morning playing Stardew Valley, but I am going to say that if this project doesn't get finished before Halloween, it's Morgan Donner's fault for introducing me to Stardew Valley. Last night I was pretty productive though. I got all of the orange, or as much as I could, sewn onto the center of the twill tape and velvet piped strips. So I measured last night and I think I have about 25 yards, but I might end up needing more than that, in which case I'm going to have to make more piping. This is all the piping that I have remaining, so I'm definitely going to have to make more piping to begin with just because I'm going to need more than this for the bodice. And then this is the orange strip that I have remaining, and I have tons of extra fabric so I can cut more of that if I have to as well. So the next step is going to be pressing all of the strips I've made. Here's one that I've just gone ahead and pressed pretty quickly, and here's one that I haven't. And as you can see, it's a little bit twisted just because the piping is sort of pulling each edge into a different direction, causing it to flare out like that. Also, the twill tape has one sort of straighter edge and one edge that is slightly fuzzy. I don't know if you'll be able to see. So this edge that isn't straight has a little bit more ease to it. So if you accidentally pull on the twill tape when you're sewing the piping onto it, you can end up with one edge that is longer than the other and slightly kind of puckered because of that. So pressing helps take care of that as well. And then once that's done, I can start cutting out the strips. But before doing that, I do have to create an overlay for the pants. I have already cut the lining out of the orange, but I'm going to do a gathered overlay out of either tulle or mesh or a combination of the two to create some more contrast. Whatever combination I use for this step is what I'm going to use to make the chemise out of as well. And I actually got the chemise drafted the other day while I was waiting for piping cords. So that's good too. So right here I have the mesh I was originally going to use. I will link where I bought this down below. It's absolutely beautiful, but it's very drapey, so it doesn't have a lot of structural integrity to it. So where these strips are going to be cut to be longer than the lining layer, so they will flare out over top of the lining, and they'll hold their shape like that because this is relatively sturdy. But this fabric definitely will not hold its shape. It'll just sort of flop over to the side and not look great. So I'm thinking I might put a layer of the tulle, which has more structural integrity underneath the netting, so you'll still get that really pretty dotted effect and striped effect at the netting, but it will have more volume to it because it will have the tulle underneath it holding it up. So these are the pants pieces, and I'm pretty sure I filmed cutting them out, and then while I was on a Zoom call with some friends, I went through and removed all the beads from them. So they are looking nice and they are prepped, and I just prepped them by removing the beads and pressing them, and then marking a line 8.5 inches away from the bottom edge, which is where the second puff is going to begin. So the pants are going to cinch in at that point. Then I just did a little bit of math and figuring out off camera. I'm going to cut my overlay out as a rectangle for the longest length it possibly needs to be, and then just sort of arrange it by eye along the top edge. Now to cover the longest portion of this panel, the puffed overlay needs to be 29 inches long. And then I want it to be about 3 times the width of the panels, so I'm going to cut it to be 72 inches wide. Oh, and actually before sewing on the overlay and everything, I'm going to sew up the outer edge of the pant legs, because each pant leg is made up of 2 pieces, and I'm going to sew them together at the side seam, just so I don't have to worry about seaming them together after the overlay is on, since then it won't look as nice. So I was going to use black tulle as the lining for this, and I actually cut it out, and then I realized I have orange tulle instead, and I have way more of this to spare since this I'm actually going to be using for another project. So I think I might go with an orange tulle lining and then put the black mesh over top of it, and then I can use 2 layers of tulle for the lining to give it a little bit more oomph. Now I was originally going to cut the lining pieces to be 72 inches wide, but I just cut the pieces of the mesh, and the mesh is about 62 inches wide. So I think I'm going to have the piece be a bit narrower, and then I don't have to sew seams into the mesh, which is just a bit inconvenient. Now I have to cut my new pieces of orange mesh, and then I can get the edges basted together, and then I can start gathering those pieces down. This is some footage that I neglected to narrate, so I'm doing it now. Basically here I have basted the layers of the overlay for the pants together. I'm just marking a line 8 inches away from the bottom edge, and that's where I'm going to gather the fabric and attach it to the point that is marked on my pants, or the lining for the pants rather. I'm very glad that I ended up using orange tulle instead of black because it was very easy to mark just using a marking pen. Then I took it over to my sewing machine and I gathered along the bottom edge, just gathering it down to the approximate length it needed to be, which was about a third of its original length, and then I repeated that process on the line that I marked 8 inches away from the bottom edge. And this made sure it was gathered nice and evenly at this point, and then as I mentioned earlier, and as I think I mentioned later, I just arranged the top edge by eye, pinned it in a way that looked pleasing, and then basted across the top edge. Air conditioner and sewing machine are both on, so I apologize for the noise, but here I have the roughly gathered down mesh overlay, and then here I have one of the pant legs with the side seam sewn. So the next step is just aligning the centered gathered point point with the marking on the pant leg. So the wrong side of the overlay is facing the right side of the pant leg. I'm going to sew along that line first and then 1/4 inch away from each side of that stitching, and then I will align the bottom edge of the overlay with the bottom edge of the lining and stitch that on, and then I will just arrange the top edge by eye until I feel like it looks good. Alright, so it is now the next morning. Shockingly, I did not get much done last night, but it's a new day and I'm planning on getting lots done today. So now with my bases prepared, I can start cutting out the strips or the paint portions and laying those atop the lining. So first I had to go through and do some math. So I knew that the bottom portion would be 7.5 inches and then there's a 1 inch allowance at the hem. And then I went through and measured out what the top of each panel would be. And then I added the 50% poof allowance to that. So all I had to do was add that bottom measurement and that top measurement and then the seam allowance measurement at the top together. So now I know what each strip needs to be cut to. I was going to do one pant leg at a time, but it's actually going to be easier to cut these if I can cut them for both legs at the same time. So I think that's what I'm going to do, even though trying to make one leg successfully before moving on is very tempting. Now that all of that is done, I can start cutting my strips to the length. I have them over here. I don't think I'm going to have enough, but I will cut as many as I have. And I have also just created labels for each piece, so I won't have to remeasure them to figure out where they go. They will have labels, so I know the order that they should be laid out. So this is the progress that I made. Annoyingly, I cut a few strips to the wrong length. I wasn't being very good about taking off which ones I'd already cut, so I cut some twice and now they're too short for the remaining pieces that I need. I need 3 additional 28 3/4 of an inch long pieces, but everything else I managed to cut out and it's all piled and labeled over there. I have just gone ahead and unspooled enough cordage to create piping for the remaining pieces, and that will be a task for after lunch. I just laid out the strips for inside all nice and pretty for an Instagram photo, and I thought I'd show you as well. So they're all labeled at the top and this is the order they're going to go on in. My camera is really overexposed. That is better. Posy scratching in the background. And before pinning these on, I've just marked a line 8.5 inches away from the bottom edge, and that will be aligned with the marking that I transferred onto the lining and also sewed across when attaching the overlay. My sewing machine's on in the background, so I apologize, but I've basted the tops of all the bands on, and then I've pinned them to the center point, and I've overlapped them slightly. I've just overlapped one side of the piping, so they are narrower at that point since the leg tapers in. And then at the bottom edge, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I'm going to have to overlap them even more, I guess. But for now, I'm just going to sew them on across that line that I've marked, and then I'm probably going to sew a 1/4 inch above and below that line as well, just to flatten it further at that point. Okay, so somehow these got significantly less even after I sewed them on. I swear it looked so much better when it was just pinned, but it's gonna be fine. After these strips were sewn on, I sewed a 1/4 inch away from each edge, and then I just aligned some velvet ribbon with the top line of stitching, and I stitched very close to the edges of the ribbon to hide the markings that I made on the fabric. So now that is secured, I can pin and sew down the bottom edge of the pained portions, and then they should start to sort of come together, I hope. Alright, so I took a couple days off to focus on a different project and also to brainstorm what I want the top of the pants to be. I was initially planning on working on the bodice and then returning to these, but I really do want to see more progress on the pants first. So I've decided at least one side is going to have stripes, probably both sides. So I got out a bunch of 2-inch long strips of both velvet and the orange material that had been de-beaded, and then I sewed those strips together, cut the strip in half, sewed the two strip wide pieces together, and repeated that once again. So now I have this 8 strip wide piece, and I think one piece of this is going to be at the front, one is going to be at the back, and then I'm going to do some lace appliques over the side and just probably line that with either orange or black fabric so the gap is less noticeable, because I don't think I'm going to be able to get the stripes to line up really nicely in the middle, though if I can, that would be great. So these are not the most even stripes I've ever sewn, since velvet is a pain in the butt to work with, and I can't press them or steam them super thoroughly because it is velvet. I know they make velvet boards for pressing velvet, but I don't have one at the moment. But I have both sides finished, or at least they're sewn onto their muslin base, and I just remembered that when I made the gray pair of pants using this pattern, these ended up looking sort of awkwardly long. They extended really far down onto the hip, so I ended up adding like a little puffed panel to create more shape, and I'm wondering if I should do that again. I sort of forgot that was an issue. However, I am planning on adding lace trim to this area as well as the bottom edge, and that might make it less of an issue. As for the lace I'm planning on adding, I haven't fussy cut this out yet, but this is what it looks like. So it is an along-con lace with some beading and some sequins, and it's going to have this kind of portion that extends upward on the sides and then the narrow trim around the bottom edge. And I might end up adding some more appliques to cover this side gore more thoroughly. And I'll link the lace fabric I bought down below. This fabric was like $40 a yard, which is a lot, but it's much, much cheaper than buying a long-con lace trim, which is like $15 a yard, because you can fussy cut this fabric out to create trim. So if you look at the pattern, it's I think 60 inches wide, but if you fussy cut this out, that is lace trim. If you fussy cut this out, that is lace trim. If you fussy cut this out, that is lace trim. And then it's actually repeated on the other side. You can get 6 yards of this lace trim out of a single yard of this material. And then you also get all of these appliques in the middle that you can cut out and place however you'd like. So even though lace fabric can seem very expensive at a glance, and often is very expensive, sometimes it's more economical than actually buying lace trim by the yard. So that's something to consider. That being said, not all lace fabrics are like this. Some of them are not meant to be fussy cut out. I searched specifically for one that could be because I knew I wanted to use it for trim. I have some pinning to do, some trying on to do, and then some playing around with potential puff and lace placement. I don't know if I actually mentioned this. I guess I thought it was pretty self-explanatory, but maybe it isn't. To turn the lace fabric into lace trim, I'm just cutting around the corded outline of the various lace pieces. So I'm just removing the mesh that you see here to turn it into something like this that can be applied to my fabric. And I do think I'm going to end up having to cut out some appliques too, just because I really want this to cover and kind of extend slightly on the front of the panels. For the bodice, I'm planning on doing a band of lace, a wide band across the chest, and I was thinking of mimicking that on the top portion of the pants and just having them be made out of solid orange. But then I feel like the lace would have to go more towards the center of the body. I'm very hesitant to put black lace appliques over the crotch. I just feel like it might look a little wrong. So I'm adding it to the sides instead, and that's how I'm incorporating the lace into the pants, so it'll coordinate well with the bodice. So I got the lace fussy cut out, and then I got it sewn onto one of the pant legs. I stitched the bottom edge down just about a 1/4 inch away from the edge by machine, and that will be covered in the seam allowance. Then starting about a 1/2 inch away from the edge, I embellished the lace trim a little bit, just using sequins. I have a mixture of 6mm and 8mm sequins, and I actually bought them all on Amazon, so I can link them down below. And I also sewed sequins around the edge, and that's actually how I secured the edge down. So I didn't even go through with running stitches to secure the outer edge of the lace. I just used the stitches that secured the sequins to sew it on. And I tried to use the sequins to fill in little gaps in the lace. Like as you can see here, there are some pretty sort of bright gaps, so I just sort of tried to fill those in as best I could. And now I have to repeat that process on the other front panel. Last night I got all of the beading finished on both panels, so now I'm just going to sew up the bottom few inches of the front seam and sew up the entirety of the back seam. I'm also going to be lining this with the orange suiting, just so if any rolls over and shows around the edges, it'll be a coordinating fabric instead of muslin. So I cut these out, but now I have to go through and remove all of the beads from them because those will be bulky and unpleasant against the skin, just like they're unpleasant to look at. And then I will pin and sew the back seam with this as well, and the corresponding few inches at the front seam. So this is the outer layer with the stripes and the lace, and then this is the lining layer, which is just the solid silk suiting. So now I'm going to match up the top edges and the front edges, and sew a 1/2 inch away from them with the right sides facing each other. And then after it is turned inward and pressed inward, I can sew up the crotch seam. So that seam won't be finished by the lining, but if I finished it first, then I wouldn't be able to turn the lining inside of the garment and neatly finish all of those edges. So I'm willing to sacrifice one finished edge to make the process of finishing all of the others much, much easier. And actually, these edges aren't going to be finished either. They're just going to be pinked after they're sewn onto the legs. And that's mainly because the top of the legs have so many bands on them that they're very bulky. And I don't want to do any additional seam finishing to this edge that would make it even bulkier. So the upper portion now looks like a very weird diaper. All of the edges are neatly finished. The lining was turned inward, and I just did some really loose whip stitches from the inside so I could press it and everything would look nice and sharp from the exterior. I also did up the crotch seam, and then I trimmed away any excess of the lining that was extending beyond the bottom edge. So now these just need eyelets up the front. As you can see, that's the portion that I left open. It's not perfectly even, especially on this side, but I think once the eyelets are in, you're not really going to notice. And I think I'm going to try and sew the eyelets in this before I sew on the pant legs, just because then it'll be easier to manipulate since there's less fabric attached to it. And I did try it on briefly, and it does fit, though it does look quite goofy. I guess the point of these pants is to look goofy, so they're coming along great, but they do look very funny. But I'm going to try and get the eyelets sewn into this today. But I do want to get some more work done upstairs first, while I have the mental capabilities to do more than just sew eyelets. So I was trying to figure out how to finish the bottom edge of the pants, and I was originally just going to have this flat and bind the bottom edge and then put something over top of it and sew it down. And the reason I didn't want to do further finishing or folding it inward is because this edge is quite bulky given all the paint portions. But I was playing around with turning it inward, and it actually creates this sort of puffed effect, which I think is really interesting and very pumpkin-like, how it sort of forms under like that. And that's really only going to be achieved if I turn the seam allowance inward. So what I'm actually going to do is create a cuff that is 1 inch wide with a 1 inch seam allowance to account for the 1 inch I left at the bottom edge. And then it will be turned inward, and the seam allowance will be whipped to the lining, so it'll permanently hold this position. And there'll be 1 inch of the cuff extending below that, and that I'm going to do the finishing on. So I'll have my band of orange with the band of velvet inside of it. And I think I'm actually going to sew that onto the cuff, the wider cuff rather, before I sew it onto the shorts. I realize that all sounds a bit confusing, but I'm going to do my best to make it make sense. So here I have the wider cuff, which is 4 inches wide. So when it's folded in half, there will be a finished edge at the bottom, and it'll be 2 inches wide, and 1 inch of that will be seam allowance. The other 1 inch will extend beyond the bottom edge of the shorts, and that will have my band on it. Now I'm a little bit worried about the cuff losing its shape since it's going to have this sort of pushing on it from the underside. So I've decided to reinforce it with a 1 inch wide strip of band roll. Band roll is a thick sort of papery feeling interfacing that typically has fusible web on one side, and it's used to stop waistbands from rolling, so it works really well for cuffs too. So this is one of the cuffs for the pant leg, all ready to be sewn on. I sewed on that band, and then I also sewed the velvet to the center of it, and that is what it looks like from the back side, so all the raw edges are hidden. And I have actually sewn on one of these bands. As you can see, there's a little bit of the cuff lining showing above the band, but once the seam allowance is tacked inward, that's pretty much going to be covered by the paint portions that hang over it. Also, though I did sew this on with a 1 inch seam allowance, clearly my basting stitches were a little bit farther away from the edge than that, so I do have to go through and remove those stitches that initially held the paint portions on. I also have to trim the seam allowance underneath with pinking shears because it's pretty grim looking, and then it is going to be folded upward and just whip stitched to the lining. But I'm probably going to sew the cuff onto the other leg first, and then I can do that process for both of them at once. Alright, so the cuffs are on, and it turns out that the basting stitches are really difficult to remove. It was actually hurting my hands, so that's going to be a task for later, and I'm going to move on to the bodice for a bit. I don't know what the bodice looked like last time we talked, but I ended up getting all of the boning sewn into the lining, or the base layer rather. And then I aligned the edges of the base layer with markings a 1/2 inch away from the edges of the outer layer of fabric, which is the silk, or 1.5 inches away from the edges in the case of the sides. And then I just cross-stitched around the edges of the interlining to secure it to the outer layer. So the next step was going to be adding a 1 inch wide velvet facing, and I actually got that drafted and cut out and everything. But now I don't think I'm going to use that. Instead, I think I'm going to just pipe the top edge of the armholes with velvet piping, and then I'm going to do either 1 or 2 lines of the velvet ribbon that I have around the neckline to incorporate it into the bodice. And then there's going to be lace appliques going across the front and probably the back as well. That I might mix it up and do some velvet stripes on the back. I haven't quite decided yet. So now what I have to do is sew up the shoulder seams so I can sew on a continuous line of piping around the neckline and around the arm openings. I also have to measure about 1.5 inches away from the outer edge of the neckline to mark the placement for the velvet ribbon. And then the velvet ribbon will have to be sewn on, as well as the piping. And hopefully I have enough piping left that I don't have to make more for this process. Sewed piping around the neckline and around the arm openings, and then I whip stitched the piping tape to the interior so it wouldn't flip outward. And then I went through using a small marking pen, and I marked the placement for the velvet ribbon. So I'm going to align the bottom edge of the velvet ribbon with the line I've marked, and then just stitch on either edge. And then I'm going to fold the bottom edge inward. I'm going to hem that and start arranging the lace appliques on the front and back. So the velvet bands are now sewn on, and they're not perfectly even, but they're honestly better than I was expecting. So I've gone ahead and turned the bottom edge inward where the inner lining ends, and then I repeated that on the sides. And now I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate the lace into the bodice so it matches the patches on the shorts. So I think this is what it's going to look like approximately on the back, and then this applique suits the front really nicely. So I'm going to base those edges inward, and then I'm also going to base the lace on, and then I will go through in with sequins, much like I did on the pants, and embellish it further and also fill in some of the gaps. But first I have to fussy cut out all the pieces that will go on the back, because this amount of mesh showing isn't very pretty. Alright, so I just took some rough measurements of my arm and then turned them into a very basic sleeve pattern. I created a mock-up for that, made some minor alterations, and now I'm going to transfer that onto paper to create a final pattern. So I can't remember if I showed you my sleeve mock-up before or after alterations, but it was a very basic pattern and I didn't have to do a lot to it. While I had it on my arm, I marked the point where I wanted to split the sleeve and have it change from being fitted to puffed. And then I transferred everything to paper and added seam allowance. So this is what the upper portion of the sleeve looks like, but this obviously isn't puffed. The puffed appearance is going to be created by the panes being cut to be longer than this panel. So much like with the pants, I'm cutting each pane portion to be 50% longer than the portion it is covering. So then I went through and I measured from the top to the bottom of the pattern piece at 1.5 inch increments, because that's how wide the strips are. So this measurement is 7 inches, this measurement is 8.5 inches, this measurement is 9 inches, etc. And then I just multiplied that by 50%. So this strip now needs to be 10.5 inches, this one 12.75, etc. And then I just added seam allowance to that. So I have all of those measurements written down over here, and now I just need to cut my strip down to those measurements. Making this strip is what I spent the majority of my last night doing. I had to make, I think, 16 yards of piping and then 8 yards of the strip, so I had to clip a whole bunch of beads off the yardage to cut those strips, and it just took a very long time. I made it a little bit shorter than it needed to be to cut all of the panes for the sleeves, because I still have these offcuts from the pants, pieces that were either left over from the strips I made that were too short to cut any of the panes from, or pieces that I accidentally cut too short. When I was doing this for the pants, I need to cut or make so much of this. I was worried that it would start to twist and warp over time along one edge, so I actually made it in several shorter pieces, but unfortunately that meant that I had kind of inconvenient pieces left over after I cut all of the necessary panes from those strips. So those can at least go towards the sleeves. So I just cut around the outer edges of the pattern for the lower portion of the sleeve, and now I have to go through and remove all of the beads from this fabric, as I've had to do with every other element, and then I will press it and cut out the dart in the center and get that sewn up. I think I'm going to do this over my lunch break, which is coming up in about an hour. In the meantime, I'm going to fussy cut out some lace for the sleeves and sort of brainstorm how to make them a little bit more special. I'm also going to go ahead and mark the eyelet placement on the pants as well as the sides of the doublet or the bodice for this, so I can start getting those sewn, because the deadline for this project is approaching and I don't want to have to sew all the eyelets on the final day. I also don't want to attach the sleeves to the bodice or the pant legs to the upper portion of the pants until the eyelets are sewn, so that is sort of a priority before seeing this all come together, and maybe I can get some of them sewn over my lunch break as well. So yesterday I had to spend most of my day downstairs doing laundry because apparently my dog's flea and tick medication did not prevent fleas, so I had to wash literally everything that she has touched. While I was babying the washing machine, I also sewed a whole bunch of eyelets. So I got all of the eyelets sewn into the front of the pants, and I also got half of them sewn into the sides of the bodice, but it's still downstairs since there's more left to do on it. These are not the prettiest eyelets I've ever done. When I first started doing them, I was doing them right on the seam point, and that was really difficult because the seam would sort of start coming undone, and then I would have to whip stitch part of the seam closed while also sewing the eyelets. So on the second side, I sewed the eyelets slightly to the left of the seam, and that was much easier, which is why the ones on that side look nicer. But they're not going to be super noticeable in the end, so even the ugly ones are okay. Now the next step is going to be sewing up the side seam of the pant legs, because now I can get them sewn onto the bottom edge of the upper portion of the pants. And before doing this, I really should finish removing that basting stitching, even though it was hurting my fingers initially. So I think I'm going to take a go at that. I also have gotten started on the hat, but that's going to be in a Patreon exclusive video. So I found a much faster way to remove these basting stitches. Originally, I was just going through with the seam ripper and trying to pull them up, but since they're going through so many layers of fabric, they're really, really tight and difficult to get up. So it's taking a really long time. Like, it probably would have taken me an hour to do this pair, but I found out if you peel the stripes back and you go underneath, you can remove those basting stitches way more easily and way faster. So that is what I'm doing now. Still gonna take me a little bit to do both pant legs. I've actually already done one, but it won't take me an hour, which is nice because I did not want to spend an hour doing this. So I sewed up the inseam for the pant legs, and then I pinned one of them onto the upper portion, did a fitting, and it looked pretty good, except it was a little bit loose at this band, and it was also a little bit too large at the top edge to sew onto the top portion without gathering it slightly. So instead of gathering it, what I did is I just took it in at the inseam since it was loose there already. So I went from having 3/4 of an inch seam allowance at the bottom to tapering it to almost 2 inches at the top, because these were originally spaced a couple inches apart, and then there was a point with no pained portions at the at either side of the seam. Now it fits really nicely, and the top edge should match the bottom edge of the upper portion. So I'm going to get them pinned together and sewn together, and then I can try them on, and hopefully they will look good. So I got the pant leg sewn on, and now the pants are done. So I've moved on to the chemise because I'm still working on the eyelets for the bodice. And after the eyelets are done on the bodice, it's going to need sleeves, but I don't want to finalize the fit of the sleeves until after I've made the chemise that will go underneath it, because those are going to add volume to the arms, which needs to be accounted for when constructing the sleeves. So this is one of the sleeves for the chemise. It's very large, as you can see. It is made of one layer of that black dotted netting and then 2 layers of tulle to mimic the combination I've used for everything else. And I used that same combination last night and cut 3-inch wide strips and then folded them in half, so they're 1.5 inches wide. And then I just sewed some black lace trim onto the folded edge, and I gathered down the top edge. These guys are going to be sewn up with a French seam on the sides, and then the bottom edge and the top edges have a 1-inch allowance, and they're going to be gathered down pretty much from edge to edge to match the arm side of the chemise and my wrist measurement at the bottom. I'm actually going to make a cuff out of velvet ribbon, and then the bottom edge will be gathered down to fit that. And what I was saying is that I think the cuff is going to close with an eyelet just so I can get a tighter fit at the wrist, which is a little bit more flattering. It will also allow me to get a tighter fit on the sleeves that go over top of the chemise as well. So I'm going to figure out what stuff is gathered down to, and then I'm probably going to turn the bottom few inches of this inward by a 1/2 inch twice by hand and whip stitch it down. The rest will be done up with a French seam, but I need some sort of opening here to allow my hands to pass through the cuffs. Alright, there's noise in the background, but that is what the hemmed sides look like. I just hemmed the bottom at 5 inches by turning it inward by about 1/3 of an inch twice, and then I basted from that point all the way up to the top. I'm not going to bother basting the top and bottom edges of the fabric together because those are going to be secured when I gather them. And then after those edges are gathered and it's attached to the cuff, I will finally do up the underarm seam. So now it is on to gathering the top and bottom edges. These are the ruffles now. This one is way more even than this one, and I'm not entirely sure why, but basically I cut a piece of twill tape to be 2 inches longer than I wanted the cuff to be, and this is going to serve as the cuff lining. So it will be top stitched to the wrong side of both the ruffle and the sleeve, and then I will put my pretty looking cuff over top of it. I have the ruffle sewn on, and this is what it looks like from the back side. It's just sewn on along the point where it was gathered. Then this is what it looks like from the front, and then this is going to come in and cover all of those raw edges. But before doing that, I had to gather down the bottom edge of the sleeves to be 8 inches, and I'm just going to repeat this process where it will be sewn on from the back side to the point where it was gathered down, and then the excess will be trimmed away to reduce bulk. And I have roughly gathered down the top edge of the sleeves as well, but mainly just because I want to secure all the layers together, and I will fine tune the gathers up here and gather it to be a little bit tighter once I know the measurement of the arm side. So I'm setting aside the sleeves for now, working a bit on the body of the chemise so I can figure out what to gather the tops of the sleeves down to. So first of all, I cut the collar pieces out of orange, and then I just seamed them together at the shoulder. And then I also cut my body pieces out of 1 layer of black mesh and 2 layers of tulle. I just basted the layers together at the sides like I did for the sleeves, and then the top edge was gathered down to an approximate measurement. Now I'm going to fine tune the gathers a little bit, and then align where the gathers begin with the notches on the collar and get them sewn on with the right sides facing each other. Hopefully this will come together pretty quickly and look just as I had envisioned. So the front and back panels of the body of the chemise have been sewn onto the collar, and then the seam allowance is pressed upward. I may have burnt a small hole into the overlay mesh fabric, not fully sure what happened there. Hopefully it won't really be noticeable on the finished thing. And then that's just what the back looks like. So next I was going to be sewing up the side seams with French seams. And once that's done, I will know how big the arm side on this is. And I can gather the tops of my sleeves down to that measurement. And I can do up the side seams of the sleeves as well. So the chemise is now looking like this. And I'm actually really pleased with it and how it fits over my shoulders. I did leave seam allowance at the center back in case I had to turn the edges inward to do some sort of eyelet closure. But actually it sits on my shoulders really nicely and has a wide enough neckline that I don't need anything to be done up after it's put on, which is fabulous. So the only closure I have to worry about adding is going to be eyelets or hooks and eyes in the cuffs, and that is a later me problem. For now I'm going to work on finishing the collar. So I ended up using these orange bands, and it was originally going to be about 1 inch wider than this, but I ended up using a larger seam allowance on the bottom edge, and then I ended up turning the top edge inward by a little bit more than I intended to, because it wasn't wide enough to do 2 rows of this wider velvet ribbon. And I think just doing one would have been proportionally a little bit weird and too narrow. So I had a little bit of this narrower velvet ribbon, which I ended up sewing about 1/4 inch above it. And I had to do 2 passes of stitching to sew down either edge, even though it is relatively narrow. I think I'm actually going to do a 3rd line of stitching through it. And this time that line of stitching is also going to secure the top edge of the collar, which I've turned inward by about 3/4 inch. Again, I've just done this by eye and focused more on keeping it about 1/4 inch away from the top edge of the velvet ribbon, as opposed to turning it inward by an even amount. Once that is secured down with another row of stitching, I can go about lining the interior of the collar, which I'll probably just do with some 1-inch wide twill tape. With the chemise well on its way to being done, I can move back onto the sleeves, which I've lost my voice all of a sudden, I'm sorry, which I was hesitant to work on until after I made the chemise that I could fit the sleeves top of. So for the paint portion, these will eventually be mounted on the arm side of the bodice, which I haven't finished yet. I still have to get the eyelets done for that, but I did figure that I could cut the tops down to match the arch that I want them to have, which is marked on my pattern. And I could also bind the top edge to prevent it from fraying just with a bit of twill tape, and that will also make it easier to pin into the bodice when it comes time, because I won't have to pin the individual strips. I'll just have a row that I can pin to the arm side. Once that's done, I'm probably going to repeat this process on the bottom, and I'm probably going to overlap the bottom slightly because the portion it has to be seamed onto at the bottom is narrower than the top, and then I will bind that bottom edge as well, making it easier to sew onto the tops of the sleeves, or the lower portion of the sleeves rather, whenever I do get those finished. So now the tops have all been trimmed to match the top edge of the pattern, and I'm just going to round out the bottom edges because, as you can see, since each strip is cut to a different length, it's quite jagged. So I'm just going to cut this to be more of a gentle curve, and then I'm going to lap them over each other so the bottom edge matches the top edge of the lower part of the sleeve that it will be sewn onto. So to make the bottom edge narrower than the top, to match the measurement of the portion it will be sewn onto, I've just overlapped the piping, so each strip is overlapped by about 1/4 inch, making it narrow enough to seam onto that panel. As you can see, the bottom edge is still pretty jagged, so I'm just going through and trimming it to be more of a smooth curve, and then going to bind that with twill tape as well. And much like when making the pants, I did label each of these pieces, so it'd be easy to lay them out and sew them in the order that they needed to be. So now these sections for the tops of my sleeves are done, so I'm working on the fitted portion that will go below them. And I got this drafted earlier on, and I actually got the pieces roughly cut out quite a bit earlier on as well. So I removed all the beads from them, and then I just went ahead and pressed them thoroughly, recut them out because they warped quite badly once they were pressed, and cut out the dart at the center, which I put off on doing until after they were pressed since I was expecting them to warp somewhat. And I've just gone ahead and sewn that dart and also turned the top edge inward by 3/4 inch. And now I think I'm going to do some banded horizontal velvet ribbon details along this edge too, to kind of mimic what's going on the neckline of the chemise. And I think at the bottom edge there's going to be some lace trim. I'm sort of just making it up as I go along. Got the velvet ribbon on and I like how it looks, so I think I'm going to do a little strip of lace at the bottom edge. So I just fussy cut out the narrowest sort of part of the lace fabric for that, and I'm going to sew the bottom edge on at the same time as sewing piping onto that edge, and then I will hand stitch the top edge down and add a whole bunch of sequins just like I have for all the other elements of this costume that have lace trim. And then the sleeves will be pretty much done aside from lining and the underarm seam. Progress has been made! I got all the eyelets sewn into the bodice. So next I was just going to be lining it so the interior looks a little bit prettier. And I've actually already cut out the lining from the same pattern, just from a muslin. So I'm going to seam those pieces together at the shoulders and then just turn the edges inward so they sit just inside the edges of the bodice. I also cut out the lining for the bottom portion of the sleeve, so I still haven't finalized the fit of these just yet. I did end up getting the piping onto the bottom edge, as well as that bit of lace applique and beadwork that I mentioned. The next step for these is actually going to be getting them sewn onto the bottom edge of the paint portion, and then getting the top edge of the paint portion sewn onto the bodice, but that will be done after it is lined. And then I'll really start to see this come together, which is exciting, but also slightly nerve-wracking. Last night, I got the tops of the sleeves, the paint portion, sewn onto the bottom, and I pinned up the side seam and I did a little fitting, and it looks like it's going to be pretty tight over the chemise, so I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance as opposed to the 3/4 inch seam allowance I originally intended when making a mock-up. And that's why I left that bit of extra seam allowance, and now it's going to come in handy. Since it is relatively tight, I've decided that instead of lining it with the muslin, which has a bit of grip to it. It's not a very smooth fabric. I'm going to be lining it with typical polyester lining. This is very thin, so it won't add bulk. It's also quite slippery, which means it'll slide much nicer over the chemise and hopefully cause it to be easier to get on as well as easier to get off. So I've recut the pieces, I've marked the front, I've cut the dart. So now I just have to sew up the dart and sew up the side seam and sew up the side seam for the sleeves as well. And speaking of lining, last night I also got the lining pinned and then sewn using slip stitches into the bodice. So it is fully lined and looking nice and pretty on the interior, and now I can sew the tops of the pinned sleeves on. And I think I'm going to do that by machine, and I'm either going to stitch in the ditch of the piping so you won't see it, or I will stitch just beyond the piping on the orange using coordinating thread, and that should look okay. I'm hoping. I just feel like machine stitching is going to be stronger than hand, and I like that added comfort with sleeves since there does tend to be a fair bit of strain on that seam. Well, all the seams have been sewn and I have the lining pinned into the left sleeve, and this is what it looks like unlined. So the lining definitely makes a difference in terms of appearance, and it's going to make them much easier to get on as well because it has that slippery interior that should slide nicely over the chemise. Okay, so I just finished sewing the lining in, and then I turned these right side out, and I realized that there's sort of a gap in the lace and the beading because I was originally going to sew this with either a 3/4 inch or 1 inch seam allowance, in which case the beading would sort of be flush against each other. There's also a small gap where the piping ends since I folded it inward an inch away from the seam. So there's that little gap as well. So I think I'm just going to pull out my sequins one more time and sew a few on to cover the gap and make it look more continuous. Now, if I was smart, I would have done this before sewing in the lining, so then all of the stitches securing the beads would be covered by the lining, and I could actually remove the lining, sew on the beads, and sew the lining back in, but I don't feel like doing that. So I'm not going to, and there's just going to be some visible stitching on the interior, but that's fine. It doesn't look quite as nice as the rest of it because it doesn't have the bulk of the lace underneath it, but I just used some sequins to fill in that gap, and I do think it looks much, much better and a lot less noticeable. So I'm going to repeat that on the second sleeve, and then I can get the sleeve sewn onto the bodice. The sleeves are now on, and I must have screwed up somewhere with my calculations because there are actually too many panes for the length of the arm side, so I had to cut one apart and stack it on top of the others, just at the center of the shoulder, but I think it's going to be fine. I just pinned them on in the orientation that I liked, and then I sewed them on by machine using black thread, and I just sewed in the ditch of the piping. So I sewed right up against the piping, and you can't see the stitches at all. So I'm really, really pleased with that. So now I think my bodice is pretty much done, and I'm going to try it on. I'm going to try it on over top of the chemise. Now, you guys haven't seen the chemise in a while, but I've actually made some progress on this too. I just sort of sloppily sewed some twill tape into the collar to finish it off, and then the arm side, since this is a sheer garment, I didn't want to bind it with anything opaque like twill tape, so I just clipped it using pinking shears, and I think that'll be fine since none of these fabrics are particularly prone to fraying. But there are clearly a few little bits that I missed. And then as for the cuffs, I decided that they were too thick to actually sew eyelets into. So I just folded the ends inward and whip stitched them down. It looks a little bit ugly from the interior, but I don't want to make the cuff any thicker by sewing in an additional lining, so it is what it is. And then I just sewed little loops onto the ends of the cuffs, or the edges of the cuffs rather. And I'm going to insert either ribbon or elastic through those and tie a bow, and that's going to be how the cuffs stay closed. So I do have some black elastic left over from my mask making adventures last year that I could use, and then I could potentially get these on and off without having to undo a tie or ribbon, which would be really convenient. I do also have the narrow black velvet ribbon that I used around the neckline as well as on the sleeves that I could use as lacing for this instead. And I do also still have to hem this. I'm gonna have to level the hem somehow and then probably hem it by machine since this garment is pretty sloppy to begin with. I don't think additional hand sewing is going to make it any better. So I tried on the bodice last night and it fits. I am feeling very, very pleased. So I spent this morning finishing up the hat that will go with this. And it looks like a pretty typical beret from the front, just with those same pane details and the mesh lining to mimic what I've done on the pants. But at the back, it's a pumpkin! I love it so much. It turned out just how I wanted, and I'm very pleased. And if you would like to make a pumpkin beret for yourself as well, the pattern and video all about making it will be up on Patreon. The pattern's for $10 and up tiers, and the video is for $6 and up tiers. So that is that. And this morning I've also made a little belt for this project, and it's not actually going to be on the exterior of this project. What I'm going to do is put on the chemise and then put this on, and it's going to help keep the chemise in place when I put the bodice and pants on over top it, but it's also going to sit the natural waistline, and if the pants scoot down or the bodice kind of shifts upward, this way you won't see a gap and you won't see the chemise underneath it. Instead, you'll see the coordinating orange fabric, and hopefully it won't be very noticeable. Now these should line up perfectly and both want to stay at my natural waistline waistline, both the pants and the bodice, but if they don't, then this is my backup plan. And speaking of the chemise, all that's left to do on it is hemming it, so that's something I'm going to do this morning. And then the pants are technically done, but I do want to go through and tack down the seam allowance on the interior, on the inseam, just because it is a little bit unruly and is slightly visible from the front too. So I just want to tuck those ends inward and whip stitch them down. The interior of the pants is not particularly pretty, just because there were changes that had to be made and they're very bulky and I don't want to add additional bulk, which is sort of necessary when you're doing seam finishing. So they are what they are. And once that's done, I need to put all of this on to do a final fitting and also go through and trim threads. But then I think it will be finished and I can take worn photos. So that's it for this one, and I'm going to include a bunch of worn photos. Actually, before I do that, here is some footage of trying to get these photos. So my shoes look like this in the aftermath of photographing this project. It's not even so much as photographing it as getting to the pumpkin patch. So we have beautiful pumpkin patch here, and then you'll notice a little bit of water there and a little bit of water there, and we have to walk through there. And I know what you're thinking, that is so grassy, the roots must offer support to the ground and it can't possibly be that muddy. Well, you're mistaken. We have some of my footprints, which have almost closed in on themselves because it is that muddy. Oh, where'd my shoe go? I stopped filming because I thought the entertaining part was over, but it got worse. So that explains why my shoes are muddy in all of these pictures. But I really hope you like these pictures and you like how this project turned out. I was a little bit stressed trying to get it done on time since there were so many elements, but I ultimately really enjoyed making this project and I really enjoyed wearing it too. I must say, wearing pants, even ridiculous pants like these ones, is so much more convenient than a skirt and so much more easy to photograph. You don't have to worry about wind or petticoats or laying out trains. It just felt very effortless and fun to wear, which I think is fitting given that it is such a fun costume. I realize it's very different than what I usually make and all my previous pumpkin patch projects, but I do hope you like it and you liked seeing the process of me constructing it. If you did enjoy giving this video a like and a comment really helps me out, and if you'd like to see more of my projects, then I hope you will subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching and so much for the support, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.